This is a video presentation of Bible 2114, Bible Survey, Unit number 19, entitled The Greco-Roman World in the First Century. After this lecture, the student should be able to trace the political developments in the Roman world during New Testament times, describe the characteristics of pagan religion of the first century, identify the major philosophies of the first century and present the main teachings of each, and describe the culture of the Greco-Roman world. Your speaker today is Dr. Jerry Horner.
One who would understand a great movement must have knowledge of the world situation in which that movement originated and operated. Therefore, the first step in the study of Christianity must be the effort to become acquainted with the life of the people among whom it arose. Jesus came into the world at exactly the right time. In the fullness of time, when conditions were favorable and the situation was propitious after long centuries of preparation, the Son of God became flesh and dwelled among men. One who is acquainted with the political, social, educational, economic, and religious life of the first century is able, therefore, to appreciate the significance of his ministry. Jesus lived in the Roman world of the first century. While his home was in Palestine, this little country itself was a part of the great Roman Empire, which was the dominant world power of the time. The Roman Empire was built on the ruins of the past. We tend to think of the first century as ancient times, but this really wasn't the case, because civilization was already old. In fact, biblical lands had been inhabited at least 5,000 years before the first century. For hundreds of years, nations had risen, flourished, and passed into oblivion in the very arena then occupied by the Romans. The Roman Empire lay around all the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. The word Mediterranean means in the midst of the land. Life in the first century centered around this strategic body of water which so often since has been the center of historic events and movements. The eastern boundary of the empire was the Euphrates River in the Near East, while westward it extended to the Atlantic Ocean. It reached up to the Danube River in Europe and went southward to the Sahara Desert. This vast territory, dominated by Rome, was the home of many different nations which had been subdued by Roman arms and was held in absolute control by the same armies. Historians estimate that these subdued national groups made up a population of approximately 100 million people who paid tribute to and took orders from government headquarters in the city on the Tiber River. The civilization of the first century is called Greco-Roman because it was made up largely by the Greek and Roman element. The thoughts and habits of life native to the various peoples under the dominations of Rome had gradually faded out and were supplanted by a combination of those of Greece and Rome, who had in turn subjugated them. Even the Jews in Palestine, despite their fierce tenacity to the teachings of their fathers, were almost overcome by these pagan philosophies and ways of life. We have already noticed that the Greek influence was even greater than the Roman, for after the conquest of the Hellenistic world, Rome did not attempt to eradicate the influence of Greek life and thought. In fact, Roman people even became imitators of Greek literature and philosophy. It was not uncommon for the Roman lord to be taught by his Greek slave. Unquestionably, Greek culture was the most powerful intellectual influence in all history. Hellenism, the Greek way of life, from the time of Aristotle and Alexander, was to the Greeks a sacred trust to be given to the world. They were passionately devoted to its propagation. The fact that the domination of Hellenism in the first century was so nearly complete furnishes eloquent testimony to the fervor and devotion of its advocates. We must not think of the Roman world as an illiterate age. Few centuries before the time of the Renaissance had a higher state of intellectual activity and enlightenment than prevailed in the Greco-Roman world of the first century. There were many uneducated people beyond a doubt, but the average intelligence was unusually high. There were great universities like those at Athens, Tarsus, Pergamum, and Alexandria, with its great libraries, as in Alexandria and Pergamum. There were schools of oratory, as the one at Rhodes, and special lecturers on philosophy or oratory who often traveled from city to city. In Alexandria, grammar had received special attention, and Greek philosophy was there studied with eagerness, except by the Jews. The translating of the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek in Alexandria enabled the Greek-speaking Jews and Gentiles also to read for themselves the Old Testament. Books were more or less expensive, since they had to be copied by hand, but the scribes were quite expert, and copy establishments like our publishers existed in various educational centers. The golden age of Latin literature had just closed. The Roman writers, Cicero, Caesar, Virgil, Lucretius, and Horace, had just passed off the scene, but their works were still read and studied. Livy and Ovid did their work at this time, and Juvenal and Tacitus were to come a little later. It was by no means an illiterate age. The chief shortcoming of such activity that it was limited largely to the upper and middle classes. There was no program for all the people, and no doubt most of the people of the lower and even the middle classes were illiterate. However, the mental alertness of the first century may be seen in the fact that the Christians in the empire were chiefly from the middle and lower classes, and yet the epistles of Paul were read in public meetings and were expected to be readily understood. There were plenty of uneducated people, as the papyri amply show, but education was emphasized. We have abundant evidence of the progress made in scholarly pursuits by educators of this century. The mathematicians of Alexandria made remarkable discoveries in astronomy. Teachers of medicine and surgery were far advanced, and the science of pharmacy was already in use. Architecture, sculpture, painting, music, law, and oratory were widely taught and practiced. In no realm did the Greeks reach higher heights of attainment than in philosophy. In the first century, the Stoics and the Epicureans divided honors for the popular favor with the people. We read in Acts 17:18 that Paul disputed with them in Athens, and all over the world were found exponents of these two systems. Socrates had called men away from mere speculation about the external universe to reflection on their own moral nature. Know thyself, he had urged. Plato carried this idea further and urged beauty as well as duty. Aristotle sought to cover all human knowledge, both physics and metaphysics. In revolt from all this speculation, Epicurus, a 3rd century philosopher who founded the system which bears his name, and Zeno, his contemporary, who founded the Stoic school, gave consideration to the problem of how one should best act in the world. Thus, they gave philosophy a more practical turn. In the midst of a world of struggle, Zeno, while pantheistic in theology, taught pride and self-control with many noble precepts, but allowed suicide in case of failure. Epicurus, really atheistic as to the gods, urged pleasure as the main good and the importance of getting it while one had the chance. The outcome was widespread immorality. In addition, the result of the teachings of first-century philosophic systems was a widespread skepticism which left unanswered the deep questions of the human soul. It was left to Christianity to supply the answer to these questions. All the nations comprising the Roman Empire had religious systems. In fact, the empire was filled with the institutions of religion. Naturally, the dominant ones were Greek and Roman, though practically every known god had some worshippers in the empire. By the 1st century, while the forms of religion persisted, the implicit faith which an earlier period had witnessed had passed away. Much of the worship was pure humbuggery. This was accompanied by a tide of skepticism which nearly engulfed the people of the period. Some doubters gave up in the quest of truth in despair. Many became pessimists, yielding to dismal fatalism. There were still gods in plenty, but no longer the childlike faith in them seen in the Homeric poems. The forms of worship were kept up, but even the priest would wink at each other on the street. Julius Caesar, Cato, Pliny the Elder, Lucretius, Varro were all skeptics. Cicero was in doubt. The Emperor Augustus, though superstitious, was an unbeliever and was himself the chief object of worship in the empire. Inscriptions show such terms as Lord, Savior, and even God applied to him. He allowed himself to be deified and to be worshipped with images in temples dedicated to him. This emperor cult was the chief enemy of Christianity in the 1st century, and early brought the Christians into collision with the Roman authorities. Later emperors decreed that they should be worshipped during their lifetime. The demand for emperor worship was pressed with great zeal by priests of the cult, especially in the provinces. The emperor cult was strong in the region of Asia, to churches of which the revelation of John was originally addressed. The temptation to burn a little incense and sprinkle a few drops of wine on an altar in front of the emperor's image must have been great to the early Christians, who could by this means escape economic boycott as well as other forms of persecution and possible martyrdom. Mystery religions, such as the Eleusinian mysteries and Mithraism, abounded in the 1st century. The term mystery meant not something vague or unexplainable, but a secret which, unknown to an outsider, might be known fully by the initiate. Usually there was a rite of purification connected with the initiation ceremony. The initiate was convinced that by this rite his sins had been washed away, and that he had been regenerated, born again for eternity. The mystery religions had their redeemer gods like Isis and Osiris, a doctrine of salvation, a baptism of blood, and a sacred meal and other secret and initiatory rites with magical powers. The worshippers held secret meetings at night and had ecstatic experiences that led to immorality. In fact, the worship of Aphrodite and Isis had a system of priestesses that made immorality a part of the worship. Salvation was by means of mystical union with deity, and this union was achieved by physical union with the priestess. The occult had its practitioners in the 1st century, as black art was used to support pagan religions. You may read about such practices in the book of Acts, chapters 8, 13, 19, and in the book of Revelation, chapter 13. In the 1st century there were many religions, but very little religion. Multitudes without much hope groped in darkness. Paul summarized the situation in Ephesians 2:12, when he said that men were without Christ, having no hope, and without God in the world. In spite of this hopelessness, however, there was a deep and genuine longing for religious satisfaction. Men were burdened with a sense of human sin and the need for fellowship with a true and holy God. They yearned for a God who knew their needs, loved them, and wanted to redeem them. The reality of this deep longing for a knowledge of the true God is one of the best established facts in the history of this period. Little did the multitudes who hungered for fellowship with God know that this God for whom they longed was to reveal himself through his Son, Jesus Christ. Greco-Roman world in the 1st century was unspeakably corrupt. There was ethical teaching in abundance, some of it very good, as in the Stoic philosophy, but there was no real connection between religion and morals. Indeed, the gods themselves were thought to consort at will with women and were utterly mythical. Immorality was a regular institution in the temple worship of Aphrodite and other goddesses. The buried city of Pompeii reveals how corrupt the moral situation was in ancient Rome. Many of the pictures preserved on the walls of houses in Pompeii are so lewd that even today women tourists are not allowed to view them. Seneca, the Roman writer, declared, "Vice no longer hides itself. It stalks forth before all eyes. Innocence is no longer rare. It has ceased to exist." Paul was not being rhetorical when he gave his ghastly picture of cruelty and terror and despair in the first chapter of Romans. For the first 500 years of the Roman Republic, there had not been one single case of divorce. The first recorded divorce in Rome was in 234 B.C., but by the first century, Roman family life was wrecked. Seneca wrote that women were married to be divorced, and divorced to be married. Romans who lived in the city of Rome did not commonly date their years by numbers. They called them by the names of the consuls. Seneca says that women dated the years by the names of their husbands. The Roman poet Martial tells of a woman who had had 10 husbands. Juvenal tells of one who had had 8 husbands in 5 years. Jerome told about a woman who was married to her 23rd husband, and she herself was his 21st wife. Infanticide was so commonly practiced that it caused little comment. One ancient writer says that baby skeletons by the cartloads could be taken from the bottom of the Tiber River. The Romans observed the system of patria potestas, the father's power. Under this system, a Roman father had absolute power over his family. When a baby was born, it was placed before its father's feet, and if the father stooped and lifted the child, that meant that the father acknowledged it and wished the infant to be kept. If he turned and walked away, it meant that he refused to acknowledge the child, and the baby could quite literally be thrown out. This would be the case particularly if the child had the misfortune of being a girl, or was sickly or deformed in some way. There is a letter whose date is 1 B.C. from a man called Hilarion to his wife Alice. In this letter he comments upon the fact that she is expecting a child. Now these are his exact words: "If it is a boy, let it live. If it is a girl, throw it out." Seneca writes, "We slaughter a fierce ox. We strangle a mad dog. We plunge the knife into sickly cattle lest they taint the herd. Children who are born weakly and deformed, we drown." Unwanted children were commonly left in the Roman marketplace. There they became the property of anyone that cared to pick them up. They were collected at night by people who nourished them up in order to sell them as slaves or to stock the brothels of Rome. Two extremes in social life prevailed. On the one hand, there were the few who were extremely rich and who held most of the wealth of the empire. On the other hand, there were the millions of extremely poor people who had little, if any, property, whose employment was uncertain, and whose existence was extremely hard. The middle class, without which no social order can exist very long, was practically non-existent. Slavery was an entrenched institution which few questioned, and apparently no one was willing to challenge. The extent of it was amazing. There were 60 million slaves in the Roman Empire. To occupy a place of respectability, the family must have a minimum of 10 slaves. Prominent families considered 200 slaves an adequate supply, although some lords owned thousands of them. They had slaves for every menial task. Some of the rich noblemen even had slaves to prompt them with witty sayings at banquets. Roman law decreed that a slave was not a person, but a thing, a tool. The lot of slaves in the empire was extremely hard. Roman law was quite clear in providing the master with the power of life and death over the slave. If the slave ran away, at best he was branded on the forehead with the letter F, which stood for fugitive. At worst, he was killed. The slave was absolutely at the caprice of his master. We read of Augustus crucifying a slave simply because he accidentally killed a pet quail. The slaves who were maids to their mistresses often had their hair torn out, and their cheeks torn with their mistress's nails. Juvenal tells of the master who delights in the sound of a cruel flogging, thinking it sweeter than any siren's song, or who revels in clanking chains, or who summons a torturer and brands the slave because a couple of towels are lost. The rich noblemen were wildly extravagant. We read of one nobleman who wasted $2.5 million in debauchery and committed suicide when he had only $250,000 left, because he could not live on such a paltry sum. Nero declared that the only use of money was to squander it, and he practiced what he preached, because in a very few years he succeeded in squandering almost $50 million. On one occasion, he gave a banquet at which the Egyptian roses alone cost almost $100,000. Let the Roman historian Suetonius describe his day, and remember, this is not a Christian preacher denouncing what he saw, but a pagan historian. Of the Emperor Caligula he wrote, "In reckless extravagance, he outdid the prodigals of all times in ingenuity, inventing a new sort of baths, and unnatural varieties of food and feast, for he would bathe in hot or cold perfumed oils, drink pearls of great price dissolved in vinegar, and set before his guests loaves and meats of gold. He even built galleys whose sterns were studded with pearls." Suetonius tells how Nero compelled people to give him banquets costing $50,000. He says that Nero never wore the same garment twice. He played at dice for $5,000 a point. He fished with a golden net drawn by cords woven of purple and scarlet threads. Suetonius tells us that Nero never made a journey with less than 1,000 carriages, with his mules shod with silver. I spoke of Caligula drinking pearls dissolved in vinegar. This was quite a common practice. At some feast, each guest was given a pearl to be dissolved and drunk. Cleopatra is said to have dissolved and drunk a pearl worth $200,000. It was an age of extraordinary gluttony. Dishes of peacock's brains and nightingale's tongues were set before the guests at banquets. The people did not eat to live, they lived to eat. Suetonius and other historians tell how the guests at banquets would eat until they could not possibly swallow another bite. Then they would excuse themselves from the room, stick their fingers down their throats, regurgitate, and then go back to start the process again. Economic conditions in the first century were far from ideal. Slave labor was abundant, while there was but little employment for public laborers. There was much idleness and unrest. In fact, honest labor was frowned upon as unbecoming to respectable people. Wealth was centered in the hands of a few, while the great majority of citizens were exceedingly poor. Despite these conditions, there was much commercial activity. Roman roads and the Mediterranean Sea carried heavy traffic and merchandise. Remarkably modern methods of accounting were used. Banking and lending of money was carried on by wealthy men who charged high rates of interest. There were factories, wholesale houses, traveling salesmen, and countless retail establishments. It was a period of big business. There were many cities of great importance in the Roman Empire. Although Rome held the place of supremacy among all the cities, it was not the only city of importance. Far east on the Euphrates, Babylon still lingered, the symbol of oriental splendor and power, the home of a multitude of Jews. In Egypt, besides the old cities of Memphis and Thebes, there was Alexandria, the city built by Alexander the Great, and now the emporium of trade, the seat of a great university and library, the meeting place of East and West. Antioch in Syria, Tarsus in Cilicia, Ephesus in Asia, Pergamum, ancient capital of a great kingdom with its great library, Philippi, the Roman colony in Macedonia, Thessalonica, the thriving commercial city, Athens with its temples and groves and university and ancient glory, Corinth, a flourishing city of trade. These are but samples of the city life of the empire. Because of the historical importance of the emperors of Rome during New Testament times, we should give brief consideration to each of these. Octavian, or Augustus, ruled from 27 BC to AD 14 and was ruler at the time of Jesus' birth, as recorded in Luke 2:1. Constructive measures and peace characterized his administration. It was he who really placed the empire on a foundation and gave it security. He was not only the best of all the emperors, but is ranked as one of the greatest statesmen in history. Tiberius, who ruled from 14 to 37, was a despot who was inefficient and unscrupulous. Although the ministry of Jesus took place during his reign, he had but little contact with Christianity. Caligula, who ruled from 37 to 41, was one of the most disgraceful and despotic of all. In only 1 year, he squandered a fortune of more than $50 million, and when he resorted to tyranny to replenish the treasury, he was assassinated. During his lifetime, Caligula encouraged the idea of emperor worship, and in other ways exhibited his vain and fanatical notions. Claudius, who was emperor from 41 to 54, had a reign of peace and prosperity, despite the fact that he was a man of mediocre ability. Acts 18:2 reveals that he expelled the Jews from Rome. Suetonius tells us that the expulsion came about as a result of a Jewish riot at the instigation of one Christus. Nero, emperor from 54 to 68, unquestionably was the most violent and vicious of Roman rulers. His unjustifiable cruelty to thousands is well known. He killed his wife and her mother, was responsible for the execution of many of his close advisors, and even ordered the assassination of his own mother. His persecutions of Christians constitute one of the most shameful chapters in even this brutal regime. He had the city of Rome burned in the year 64, and then placed the blame on the Christians. It was during his reign that Paul and Peter, as well as thousands of others, were martyred. His unpopularity grew to such proportions that he took his own life. For a year following the death of Nero, the empire was ruled by 3 insignificant rulers. Vespasian was the ruler from 69 to 79. During his reign, Titus, his son, destroyed Jerusalem in the year 70. Titus became emperor at the death of Vespasian and ruled from 79 to 81. He was a popular and benevolent ruler. Domitian, the brother of Titus, was emperor from 81 to 96. He was one of the most vain and cruel of all the Roman emperors. He demanded that people all over the empire worship him as a god. In the province of Asia, at least, Christians experienced severe persecution for their refusal to worship the emperor. The book of Revelation reflects this situation. This brief survey has shown the first century Greco-Roman world to be characterized as intellectually advanced, commercially progressive, morally corrupt, socially decadent, religiously skeptic, and politically stable. All these conditions set the stage for the introduction of Christianity.
This has been a video presentation of Bible Survey, Unit number 19, entitled The Greco-Roman World in the First Century. This program has been produced by the Department of Educational Media of Oral Roberts University.